Hi, I'm Alex Howard, and welcome to Conscious 2. My guest in the studio today here at the Integral European Conference in Budapest is Jeff Salzman. Hi, Jeff.
Hi, Alex.
And in today's interview, we're going to be exploring news, politics, current affairs in the context of being on a spiritual path. Jeff has a blog called Daily Evolver, where he really gets into current affairs, events that are happening from the perspective of the integral approach or spiritual practice. And Jeff has been involved in the integral movement for over 10 years and is really one of the key thought leaders in that area. So Jeff, maybe as a starting point, it's somewhat unusual, the Daily Evolver, in the sense that it's really following what's happening and I guess giving a different perspective on it.
Yeah.
Why do you feel that's important?
Well, because the world can be quite depressing.
This is true
to people, and there's still war, there's poverty, there's a lot of human suffering, and it's true that as long as really anybody's suffering, we're all suffering. That's a sort of a spiritual truth and realization is that we don't rest while anybody is in need and pain, and so we all. You see the sort of chaos and confusion and politics and all of the mendacity and hypocrisy and so forth, and it's easy to get depressed and to just want to tune it out.
Which is one of the things that's interesting. That it seems to me that, and I see it in my own kind of friendship network, that there's a kind of checking out of not want to watch the news. It's all just bad news. It's all depressing.
Yeah.
But it somehow also feels that can be an escape.
Yeah, I think so. And I think that one of the great things about Integral is that Integral gives us a broader perspective, a historical perspective for sure. And we see that, despite the, chaos, there's actually a pattern. And there's actually a movement in history. And it's an upward movement. It's a movement towards, what we say in Integral, and a movement towards greater goodness, truth, and beauty. And that's very difficult to see. And I don't expect people to swallow that because I say so. But it's true that in the present only looks bad. Well, it doesn't look so bad if you look at it in the context of history. And we see that we have more people living better, more decent, more free, more prosperous, more traveled, more communicated, more educated lives than ever. And radically so, actually. And the trajectory of this, upward movement, if you will, is increasing. And, I think at this stage of the game that we could see the end of war is in sight. The end of poverty is in sight. What we have now with our technologies and so forth, even our sustainable technologies, is the ability to create a decent life for everybody on the planet. I mean, that's doable right now. The question is, how do we distribute? How do we, create systems where that happens? And the truth is, we're creating it. We're moving from, if you look at the history of humanity, we move from tribal to nation states to nations, and now we have a world-centric, particularly among the most progressive people. I mean, not everyone is world-centric, but a huge number of people, particularly people in power, is the truth of the matter, are really thinking in terms of global problems now.
Part of what I think is really interesting about what you're saying is you're painting a pretty, I hear realistic, but also positive perspective of the future. And I think what a lot of people still do, and I know that in an integral perspective, this is very well understood, but people romanticize 10,000 years ago and say, we used to have it so much better, and how we've become more inhumane, more violent. Maybe you could just speak to that, because that's...
Yeah, it's a very, very common misconception. And the truth of the matter is that violence is decreasing radically in the world. And not just, crime violence, interstate violence. We have, basically, what do we have, 7 billion people. And what ought to be the headline is 6.9 billion people are living in peace. You know, that's new in the world. That's new in the world. That if you look at, in fact, I saw a video of the map of Europe over the last, I think it was 1,200 years or something, and it was just times, like right? Looking at this sort of spaghetti mess of borders and how they changed and just all of the conflict over history. Yeah. And one of the things we see in integral theory is that a lot of the struggle and a lot of the conflict in the world is actually struggles between these various worldviews. Mm-hmm. And so we have these sort of what we would call the traditional worldview, which is nationalistic and religious and more ethnocentric. Mm-hmm. We have a modern worldview, which is more secular, a little less ethnocentric, mm-hmm. and we have and rational. And then we have the postmodern, or sort of a pluralistic view, which is more world-centric. Mm. And that once you get to this secular worldview, this modern worldview, it's actually quite pacifying. Mm. In fact, there's a principle that Tom Friedman of the New York Times talks about called the Golden Arches Principle. And that is that no country with a McDonald's has ever attacked another country with a McDonald's. And there's truth that's true. Now Russia and Ukraine are going to test that here in the next upcoming, because they both have McDonald's. Okay. But even there, I mean, are we going to see a full-scale war in the way that we're used to in human history? Yeah. I doubt it. Unlikely, yeah. And if you look, it's one of the things that there's a wonderful book by Steven Pinker of MIT called The Better Angels of Our Nature, mm-hmm. where he goes through and demonstrates conclusively the fallacy that you're talking, this sort of mm-hmm. retro-romantic mm-hmm. fallacy, mm-hmm. where the indigenous people lived in peace. No, they didn't. Mm-hmm. There's a new field called forensic anthropology, where part of what they're doing is looking at how people died in the past by looking at skeletons.
It's a little more brutal.
Exactly, and most of them died with a hatchet in their skull. Wow. The levels of violence in indigenous tribes, even indigenous tribes today, is higher than, it dwarfs anything we see in the worst of our Western inner cities even.
Yeah. I know that 8-9 years ago, reading Ken Wilber's book Up From Eden. Yes. It's like, the amount of human sacrifice, and it's surprisingly few years ago that actually, in the time of history, that stopped happening.
Yeah. Human sacrifice, cannibalism, slavery, these are all gone. I mean, we still have some of them, but even slavery we have. Yes. But it's in every case criminal. Yes. It's no longer state sanctioned, where you would buy and sell people at the town square. Yeah. Which we were doing 100 years ago.
Yeah. We just watched last weekend, The Butler.
Yes.
Shocking. In fact, we watched the next night, Mandela. Those 2 nights of watching the kind of history of racism. We're talking things that happened in my lifetime, and I'm only in my 30s. Yes. I mean, it's extraordinary.
Look at Europe 70 years ago. Yeah. Here we are in Budapest. Yeah. I mean, it's just jaw-dropping. Now, look at Germany and France, for instance, at war for millennia. Mm. And of course, World War I, World War II, horrible, war. And now the idea of Germany and France going to war with each other is just...
It's unthinkable.
It's unthinkable. Yeah. And that's the power of modernity and postmodernity.
Yeah, and one of the things that's always struck me as well is, if Henry VIII had nuclear weapons, there's the capacity to destroy is there, but it isn't used.
That's right.
But I wanted to pick up on something as well. You said you see the potential for the end of war. I mean, that's quite a statement. Yeah. I guess I'm curious as to what you see would need to happen for that to become a lived possibility.
Yeah. Well, there's something that Ken Wilber has said, that he's one of the integral philosophers that a lot of us pay attention to, and he said something that it first struck me as kind of simplistic, but I actually realized the truth of it more I think of it, and that is development is the answer for everything.
Okay.
So that's basically it. Like
Yeah.
I said, once countries reach modernity, and I'm not just talking modernity in terms of the exteriors, in terms of science, in terms of technology, but in terms of the interiors. There's something that happens. That's one of the really key principles of integral, is that there's an evolution of consciousness and culture. In other words, an evolution of my own individual consciousness, or the individual consciousness, and also the cultural consciousness. So once people and cultures reach modernity, it's actually just self-evident that, because we know history, we've lived through it, we see it, that the way forward for my people is not to conquer my neighbor. That's actually too much trouble. You know,
That's one way to put it. Yeah.
It's just not worth it. The way forward is for me to trade with my neighbor. And so, yeah, so now we might have some economic warfare, and that might be ugly, and everybody might get all upset about that, and rightly so. But let's just say that economic warfare is a stage higher than military warfare. And so it's true that studies have shown that roughly 70% of the population of the world is ethnocentric or below, or egocentric even. So they're pre-modern. So that's still vast majority of people. But and this is where, you know, two cheers for elitism, because the elites in most countries, you know, there's the outliers, there's North Korea, there's some of the countries in Africa, and you could argue that, you know, maybe even Putin, I don't know, but there are people, but most of the people who are in power are operating at a modern or postmodern, world-centric point of view. And again, that's very, very pacifying. So as countries continue to develop, and even countries that are more pre-modern, like in Africa and so forth, the sort of center of gravity of the power in the elites of the rest of the world will sort of, you know, moderate and modulate some of their more ethnocentric impulses. And so we can see that happening with UN peacekeepers and so forth. This is completely new, you know, historically.
Yeah, I sometimes think about world leaders like a big playground. And if you've got enough people in the playground playing by the rules and playing the way they should, it makes it difficult for others to,
that's right.
to act out.
I think that's a very good example.
Yeah. I also, going back to where we started, about why should those in a path care about the news, care about politics, care about these kinds of issues? What, you know, I very much see the value for the world of more people engaging those issues, but what's the value for the individual? You know, for someone's own, you know, is there something in seeing their own reactivity? And so what do you see for people of what supports their own evolution of engaging with the outer world in this way?
We have a duty. We have a responsibility to care and to know and to pay attention. I mean, I just put it as simply as that, is that, you know, another one of the principles of integral theory is that an irreducible dimension of our lives is the collective. I mean, we have I'm an individual, you're an individual, but we have a responsibility to each other, and we have a responsibility to the whole. And so if you're really going to live a good life, you know, if you're going to live even a happy life, you have to be engaging, and you have to care about the rest of the world. And I actually think that this sort of pessimism and malaise and this sort of, you know, depression that we see, particularly in some of the postmodern people, is, you know, it's a cop-out. It's too easy.
I agree.
You know, it's irresponsible.
And so, for someone watching this that maybe is triggered by that, how do we help someone move with that? Because it as I kind of start off at the start, it seems to me that happens for a lot of people. It's like they've almost become overwhelmed by engaging with the world. That part of what supported for a while their practice maybe is that disengagement, but what supports someone in coming back in and re-including that?
Yeah. Well, I think just see the world as it is, and one of the things that is true is that there is this upward trajectory of the world. That's just, it's sort of self-evident when you look at it, and the things only look bad and depressing when they're compared to some idea or some ideal of what the world ought to be. Well, fine. I mean, we all need to have our ideals and models of how things ought to be. And of course, the world always falls terribly short of that. Okay, but still, if you look at where we were at the beginning of the millennia, at the beginning of the century, and where we are now, and the a billion people risen out of poverty in the last 20 years. I'm sorry, in the last 20 years. That's amazing.
It is.
That's
Yeah.
astonishing. There's still another billion to go, but it's happening quickly, and this sort of pacification of peoples, that's actually true. And so, yeah, the world looks bad when you compare it to your fantasies,
Indeed.
but it looks pretty good if you compare it to history.
And do you think there's something in people's rejection of what they don't like outside of them that is also a mirror to what they reject inside of them?
Yes, I do. I do, and I think that that's very well put. And a lot of us have spent a lot of time in therapy in order to get rid of our own sort of self-abnegation and self-hatreds and all of that sort of thing. But we don't have any problem projecting it on the human race as a whole. That's really the next step. I mean, we need to do group therapy,
right.
And I'm talking big group therapy,
right.
In order
we
to
have a whole conference here.
Exactly, in order to do some of the work collectively that many of us have done individually.
Yeah.
And actually say, hey, this is a great life. I mean, there's problems and there's deep suffering in all of our lives, and there's abject suffering for some people on the world. So let's get busy and work with that and fix that. But let's not forget that this is an astonishing gift to be alive on this planet at this time. Astonishing, and it's irresponsible not to be grateful for that.
That's very
somehow.
beautiful. I think it's very true.
Yeah.
That's very true. What do you feel, in the daily evolver and the different stories, in a sense, that you're following, what feel to you the real issues of this time? The things that feel the greatest crisis or opportunity, what concerns you, or what do you feel engaged with?
Well, one of the things we see in using integral theory is that in terms of the economic systems, that the economic system of modernity is growth. And that's sort of the religion of modernity. When you move to postmodernity, which is pluralistic and ecological and so forth, the economic view is for sustainability. And I think that movement from this sort of growth mentality to a sustainability mentality is really one of the key issues, because one of the things that still could get us is the climate change, the ecological situation, the poisoning of the planet, of the oceans, of the atmosphere and so forth. We've made enormous strides in terms of cleaning up rivers and the air in cities and so forth, particularly in the West and in developed countries. This is why development is important.
Sure.
But in terms of polluting the global commons, that's a huge issue. That's probably the big issue. And then also just the distribution of wealth. At some point, we look back at, how could people have enslaved each other? And just 100 years ago, and yet for all of human history, people enslaved each other. And we look at that, and it's sort of, how did that happen? I think in 100 years, we'll look at our time now and say, how did we allow some people to have so much while some people had so little? It's just going to be, there's a moral indignation that arises at a certain stage of development where it's just not okay for that to be happening. And so that's another one. Just this, again, we have plenty of wealth. We're getting, we're amazingly good at creating wealth. It's just getting it in a way where everybody gets to share in it is another of the big issues of our time.
Yeah. We've got about 5-6 minutes left. I'm also, I'm curious as well, because one of the things that's in my mind is, as we see more development in India, China, and countries that are developing at a huge rate, that feels like, on one hand, it feels very exciting. And on the other hand, you mentioned at one point overpopulation. It's like, I'm curious if any thoughts you've got around that. It feels to me like a really concerning issue.
It is indeed, and there, It's again another issue where development is the answer, because it's at these early pre-modern stages of development where people have 5, 6, 7 kids. And the reason they do is two reasons. One is because their kids die because of infant and childhood mortality. And two, there's no social security. There's no social safety net. And so my safety net in my old age is to have a lot of kids who will take care of me. And so as we move into a more modern mindset, in modern countries, in some countries like Italy and in Scandinavia and so forth, they're barely keeping up with reproduction of the population. We see in Mexico, for instance, that 50 years ago women had 7 children. Now they have 2 children. And this is just natural development. There was no one-child policy or anything draconian about that. And so as we develop social safety nets, as we have childhood medicine and so forth, people don't want to have 7 children. It's a lot of trouble to have 7 children.
2 children.
2 children is a lot of trouble. Yeah, and so actually, this is another thing that is true, particularly as we move into post-modernity.
Yeah.
And that is, it's okay to not have kids at all.
Yeah.
And so we have, that you can have a respected lifestyle and not have children. And that's new in human history. And that's just plain old development.
Yeah.
Evolution.
Yeah. It's very true. And I'm curious as well, people that are watching this that are connecting, resonating with what you're saying, want to engage more with the news, current affairs, but also I think part of what can be difficult is watching traditional news. Of course, it doesn't give you a balanced perspective. And I understand when people watch a very sensationalist version of the news and come away just kind of not wanting to engage.
Right.
The Daily Evolver is obviously a great resource. How can people engage with that? And any other suggestions you have of people finding a way to follow the news that's useful, I guess?
Yeah, I actually think one of the things I do in the Daily Evolver is I identify news sources that I think are a little more integral and a little more balanced, if you will, because if it bleeds, it leads. That's one of the principles of journalism. And it's because we human beings are, God bless us. We're part of our evolutionary potency is that we're focused on what's wrong. That's just, we're naturally built for that. The caveman who relaxed in by the riverside and didn't pay attention to the saber-toothed tiger coming up is the one who didn't live to reproduce. And so the anxious and hyper-vigilant, that's built into us. And so that's true of the way we see the world. We have a negativity bias. It's well established in psychology. And so we have to actually work with that in our own minds and bodies. And, I think, I don't know the international media as well, but I'm a fan of The Economist for the most part as a magazine. I like Fareed Zakaria as a commentator. And yet I notice myself sometimes when I come home from work and I'm tired and I want to turn on some news while I'm making dinner or whatever, I'll turn on something that's sensational because I actually need a hit of adrenaline. Do I want somebody who's just considered and and reasonable? Not necessarily. It's not as much fun.
It's so interesting you say that because it feels kind of uncomfortable. My hands up to it, but sometimes when there's a big disaster news story, I can feel the place in myself where entertainment's the wrong word, but there's some adrenaline's a good word. Yeah. Something that lights up with that.
Yes. Or when the commentators are arguing with each other and shouting over each other. It's it's exciting. Yeah. And so fair enough, that's fine. Let's just notice that. And notice that that's not reality. Yeah. That has been finely tuned by very smart media people whose job it is to keep eyeballs on their show. I mean, and they count those eyeballs and they sell those eyeballs to advertisers. And so they're very, very good at keeping our nervous systems hooked. And so notice that. Yeah. I mean, that's not to say you can't do it. It's like you can have a drink, but just notice, why and what's going on. And that's not reality. That's a view of reality that is built on an orange media market.
So final question, it could be a whole interview in of itself, but we engage more with the news and, when we feel touched by it, what can we then do?
Yeah. Well, I think, this is going to sound a little bit airy-fairy, I suppose. Of course, we can help. We can, work in our own communities, and, there's that think globally and act locally and all that good stuff. But one of the things that we can do is think better thoughts about the world, and to not, and to challenge our own negativity biases, and to have better conversations. It's like Ken Wilber talks about, thoughts are things. Actually, and again, a little airy-fairy, but there's a morphogenetic field of thinking in the cosmos. And so the more sophisticated you're thinking, to think a higher level thought is actually a contribution to the cosmos. To have a higher level conversation is a contribution to the world. So don't even minimize that. Just watch your own thinking is one thing you can do. And then get out and, open your eyes and your heart and your mind and your wallet and do some good.
Yeah.
You're going to die anyway. So, make it count.
Yeah, that's very beautiful.
Yeah, right on.
Great. Thank you,
Yeah.
Jeff.
Oh, Alex, what fun.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for watching. And we look forward to talking with you again, hopefully, very soon. Bye-bye.